Good morning or afternoon to you all and welcome. Thank you so much for joining Withum today. We have a great presentation in store for you all. And before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping items to cover. You will all be on mute during the presentation. However, at the bottom of the toolbar, you will see a chat box. We encourage you to ask questions during the session, which our speakers will answer at the end of their presentation. Please note if your question is for a specific speaker, as we have a few today. And this session will also be recorded for future reference, and a link to it will be provided to all of our attendees. Feel free to share additional thoughts or input after the webinar has wrapped up as well, as your feedback is greatly appreciated. With that, I'm going to turn it over to today's moderator, Jim Hannon, partner and practice leader of Withum's Manufacturing, Distribution, and Logistics Group.
Thanks, Alexis, and once again, welcome everybody. As the leader of the firm's services to the supply chain group of companies, and that encompasses manufacturing, distribution, and logistics. And obviously, supply chain has gotten a lot of press over the last year and a half or so. So we're, to those of you that are in the industry and making it happen and getting product from the factory to the shelves, thank you. We're one of our firm's largest industry verticals, and we're very proud of the clients that we serve within that sector. But we've seen an emerging focus and interest on all companies in the supply chain lately, where the final manufacturer or the wholesaler is committing substantial resources to get comfortable with the business practices of their indirect and direct suppliers. And, you know, as a service provider, we're an accounting and advisory firm. We receive a fairly extensive request list from companies requesting questions or requesting answers to questions on our governance, our commitment to equity, and our commitment to sustainability. So we're just proud as punch for me to introduce our ESG practice leader, Joe Holman. Joe joined us last year. He's got over 25 years experience. He was the founder of a consulting company, ESG Administration, which was the vision of balancing the interests of the sustainable world and investment strategies using ESG guidelines and information, and a recognized expert in the field. So we're thrilled to have him on board to share his experiences and counsel in extending this offering to our clients and contacts. And Joe, since you've joined us, you've been a busy bee with respect to questions that have come up from the marketplace. Also, one of the instructors today is Sophia Assab. Sophia works with Joe on his ESG team here at Withum. She's passionate about sustainability and economics, and recently graduated with her master's from Columbia. So we're happy to have two very qualified presenters handling today's presentation. So Joe, I'll turn it over to you. And again, please feel free as part of our audience to raise questions as you see fit during the course of the conversation. Take it away, Joe. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Jim, for that kind introduction. I guess you go to the next slide just to see who we are. And yes, I am the ESG practice leader at Withum Advisors. And you wonder, like, why did I join a CPA advisory firm? Why is that actually ESG or appropriate for ESG? And if you think about what does a CPA firm do? We measure, observe, report, and verify. And that's really what the ESG industry needs. There are people that better measure information, observe the information that's being reported and measured, and verifying that information for legitimacy. That's a major issue within the ESG space. And that's, you know, what a CPA firm delivers, and why connecting it to it with an advisory side really made a lot of sense for when I joined. And then with me today, I have Sophia, who was introduced. Hi, Sophia.
Hi, so good to be here. Thank you.
And yes, we are we are very happy to be growing this practice because of ESG is everywhere, but it really does apply to real life businesses. And hopefully today we're going to show how. Next slide. So today I want to go through some of the ESG considerations for manufacturers and discuss then elements of a supply code of conduct, which is something very important that people need to consider. It's often over time overlooked and underappreciated, but it's something that comes up that could affect whether you get a procurement or not, or whether you want to give a procurement to somebody else. So we're going to go through that. We're also going to talk about how customers and owners receive sustainable information. How do you report that information? How do they understand that you are sustainable other than just having them pick up the phone and speak to you? Well, Sophia is going to get into help on the zero waste program and discuss a waste and how waste costs money. We're going to get into the SEC climate change proposal that came out. And the last two elements really are about the financial effect of sustainability on the financial statements and how they do have a direct impact. And that's, the source of the SEC's proposals as well as waste. Next slide. So when we're looking at ESG considerations for manufacturers and within the supply chain, that would be your upstream activities. There's a number of activities we could look at, but today we're really going to just focus on the environmental issues because that's what, that's all we really have time for. Going into labor conditions, reputational risk, raw material sourcings, themselves could be separate presentations. So we're not going to look at that. Within your own operations, because as a manufacturer, you also could be a supplier. You could be a tier 2 supplier to a tier 1 supplier who goes to ultimate to a customer. So we'll consider waste at your own operations and the carbon emissions from your own operations. So we're going to completely ignore your downstream emissions and environmental impact, again, for sake of time. Next. Now, one thing you really can't, you have to always consider with ESG, I think it's really important, is there are regional differences in ESG depending on your audience. So when dealing with the European audience, for instance, they are focused on climate change. Climate change means greenhouse gas emissions, and they want to they want to know what your emissions are. They want to know if you have emission targets, and they want it verified by a third party. They introduced laws called the EU taxonomy, which is requiring companies like yourselves at a certain size to begin reporting this information to the government and to databases. And it's something that you're going to start seeing in the United States, because Europe is about 2 or 3 years ahead of the United States in terms of climate change. So if you want to know where the United States is going in terms of sustainability and ESG, just look to what Europe is doing today. On the US side, it's important to note that US is very focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, especially after the George Floyd incident of 2 years ago. We have a lot of discussion that companies need to be diverse, have equity and inclusion. You see a lot of advertisements in the media. This is things that people ask. But coming down on supplier questionnaires, they'll ask you, do you support women-owned businesses? Do you have minority type businesses to support? What's your organizational makeup? So it's very important in the US side, not as much in the European side. And then you have states differences. So California, DEI, and naturally the environmental stewardship issues. I mean, California is in the hotbed of climate change. And if you think about it, they have fires, they have drought, they have water scarcity. Lake Mead is drying up. So that's all Western the United States. That's something they're very much interested in. So when dealing with customers and people from that region, that's things that they're going to want to talk about. When working with Texas, I just have to bring Texas into this because in 2020, they passed a law saying that you are not allowed to state that you boycott guns and fossil fuels, which I thought was rather interesting. So that any company that states that they're boycotting guns or fossil fuels will be disinvested by pension funds and funds controlled by the state of Texas. So Texas Teachers Association invests in a lot of private companies, and they would be divested from those companies if those companies take positions against fossil fuels. Now, this was a Ted Cruz law that was a showmanship for him, and the law really doesn't affect anybody unless they stand up on a soapbox and scream that this is what they're doing. But I did think it was interesting that, so if your clients are from Texas, you can downplay your involvement with oil and guns. And where guns came in from, I have no idea. Next slide, please. So something really important to note here is the supplier code of conduct. And Jim had mentioned in the introduction a little bit about this. So companies today, best practices, issue every vendor they deal with a supplier code of conduct in which they're required to sign. And it's just best practices in ESG. Any ESG analysis of a company asks if you require your suppliers to sign a code of conduct. When private equity firms invest in you, they would ask, do you require your suppliers to sign a code of conduct? And then you as a supplier of companies probably are also getting these documents or these requests. Somebody in your office is probably signing these documents, whether you know it or not. Now, all of them are relatively the same, or for the most part. They all have 4 elements. They abide by the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact, which I'll go through what they are on the next slide, but just know every one of them does.
Joe, question came up if you have, it seems to be specific to, that topic. What happens if I push back on providing ESG information to customers? I guess more of a disclosure issue. What are the ramifications if presumably this is a private company? Well, again, what happens if I push back on providing ESG information to customers?
Well, then the customer themselves would make a decision whether they want to do business with you. So now a large corporation would categorically say that everybody has to sign it. So choosing not to sign means that you won't be able to, they won't do business with you. And that's really the stick that they have to get people to sign these documents. Just like when you sign up on software, you have to click that you agree to their terms of privacy before they let you use the software. This is the similar where you have to sign the documents for them to do business with you. Now, if you're a major company and you're the only one that supply a particular widget, there are decisions that have to be made from an economic and a business standpoint, but most people are not in that position of power where they can say, I'm not going to give you my product then. And most people don't mind, because when we get into what the elements are of a supplier code of conduct, it's things that you wouldn't do anyway. So,
thank you.
Okay, so you always abide by the UN Global Compact, and a lot of people always ask that question, what is that? So we'll look at the next slide what that is, but you'll see if you read your supplier codes of conduct, you'll see these elements. The next thing is it's always subject to verification, which it could include outside audits. Now, the outside audits typically don't happen for the US companies that do business with their customers. Usually this is for overseas companies that are located in Asia, where you hear about sweatshops and items like that taking place, and you actually have firms go in there to see whether you do have forced labor, child labor, prison labor, who's actually doing it. But typically there is some form of verification. You also have a penalties for non-compliance, which Jim just actually highlighted, is what happens if I don't do it, what if I don't comply? Yeah, they just don't do business with you. It's not like a legal situation. So if I violate human rights, that's okay. We just won't work with you anymore. And the last element that's kind of important to understand is there's a sustainability scorecard that's becoming more and more popular among more sophisticated companies, because ESG is an evolving business and it's becoming more sophisticated each year. And I put up an example of the homepage of a supplier sustainability assessment that Walmart does. And you can see the elements that they include in this assessment, and it's all along the lines of environmental factors. And the reason why environmental factors are part of a sustainability card is of ESG, environmental issues are the ones that you can easily measure and benchmark. and quantify in a real way against others, so that in Walmart's example, you would complete their scorecard and then you would be assessed against other vendors that are similar within the Walmart system. All right, next slide. All right, on to the UN Global Compact Principles. This is, I'm sure, everything you've been waiting for. There's 4 elements to them. You have human rights, labor, environment, anti-corruption. Nobody on the planet will openly say that we violate any of these provisions and have trouble saying that, no, we're not in compliance with basic human rights. We definitely don't like child labor. And every company in the world seems to sign these off without any issue. And we read a number of them where they even go as far to say that children can't work at night. And we're looking at the apparel companies, which this really, certainly the human rights and the labor situation plays into, is very problematic, because there's 25 million people in forced labor. Every company in the United States seems to fill these out, yet it still exists in Southeast Asia in a large part within the apparel business industry. The other industry that there's a lot of forced labor is in the mining industry, and specifically mining for cobalt. Cobalt's a critical element in batteries and EV vehicles like Tesla, and most of it comes from Congo, and Congo has an issue with forced labor in its mines, and there's organizations and there's audits and there's a lot of work done to try to stop it, but it still exists. So things to think about within that global compact. As it relates to us today, we're looking at principle number 8, which is on the environmental side. We promote greater environmental responsibility, and that really relates to greenhouse gas emissions and waste and water usage. So next slide. So how do we, first of all, this we're going to get into now. How is this information communicated to customers? It's going to be the first part. The second part is going to be how it's communicated to investors. So if you're a private company, this is not a public company form until the end when we do talk about the SEC. First of all, before you report to companies, if you haven't been asked yet, you're growing and you're going to become of significant size, you probably will be asked sometime. It's always good to know what the answer is in advance. So I always recommend that you start thinking about completing these types of forms, calculating this information, building this into your workflows, so that the time comes when they ask, not only will you be ready to provide that information, but you've already had time to manage that information. So that's just words to live by, is prepare before you're asked, because eventually you will be asked, and you might even be asked now and you don't even know it, and somebody in your procurement group is just filling out numbers. So on to reporting to customers. CDP. So CDP is a platform that customers use to report their greenhouse gas emissions, water usage, forestry impacts, and it's been set up where large customers are also able to ask their supply chain to complete surveys so that they can roll up into their larger customers. So in the blue box, you can see 200 organizations are asking $5.5 trillion of procurement supply chain customer spending to report GHG emissions and targets to CDP. That's a lot of emissions. And I thought I read somewhere it was like 1,500 vendors that are being asked to do this. And the number is only growing year over year over year. If you had the chart, you would have been able to see that. So it's something that a lot of the Fortune 500 companies are signed up to. They all report it themselves, and now it's getting into the supply chain. Next slide. And when you think about it, how is it getting in there? Well, CDP actually came up with a supply chain reporting program where for a little extra money, right, the customers get to report to requiring the customers, the suppliers of the customers, which is the larger companies, to report to CDP certain information on their supply chain. We're talking about, well, anyway, I want to go into the one thing I want to mention on this slide without repeating the last one, is that the suppliers and CDP believe that by measuring your emissions, you have energy savings. So it's not just a headache completing the forms, complying with your customer in terms of filling out your greenhouse gas emissions. It's thought of that if you measure it, you will manage it. And if you manage it, you'll save energy. And when you save energy, you save money. And in 2021, somehow CDP calculated that they were responsible for emissions reductions of 1.8 billion metric tons of emissions. That's carbon emissions, saving suppliers, people like you on the call, $29 billion. That's a lot of money. That's money that would have gone away had they not, according to CDP, reported it by measuring it and then managing it and setting emission targets.
Hey, Joe, question came up in connection with somebody starting that journey. It looks like in our audience. How much time does it take to measure the emissions to then report on it?
So, depending on how complicated your structure is, it could take a little bit more time than other, like how many locations you have, what type of operations you have within your structure, within your business footprint. If you're looking at scope 1, 2, and 3, which we'll get into the defining those later on. But if you set up the process to collect the data, it doesn't take that much time. And it's really a process-oriented exercise. You're already collecting a lot of the data within your books and records. So you just add memo information to some of the bills that you're paying that report fuel usage and utility usage. So it could take very little time, or it could take a lot of time if you're disorganized and you go at it all at once. So it depends on the process.
Thank you.
On to, well, who's making us report ESG and why? Which is, the why is probably the big part, is that, you know, as I said, many of the large companies are setting these carbon emission targets. And you hear in the news, all of these companies today seem to be going net zero by 2030. They all support the Paris Agreement. They're all, yes, net zero, net zero. Well, how are they getting net zero? Well, they're doing it because they push their supply chain to do it. As much as 90% of the emissions of a company's come from their supply chain. So what better way to reduce your emissions than to push that down to your supply chain? And what they're doing is they're pushing their emission targets down onto their suppliers. So if they commit to reduce their emissions by 50%, they have to ask and require their suppliers to reduce their emissions by 50% over a given number of years. And this is only, you know, applicable to obviously the more material suppliers of these large companies, but this is why it's happening. It's also very inexpensive for these large companies to implement these policies, because who's doing the work? It's the supplier. So they're able to push down not only the responsibility of it, but the economic pain and the work to get that done. And the example of the companies that are doing it, just to give you how broad of the industries they are, you can see you have cosmetic companies, you have retail companies, beverage companies, technology companies, car companies, athletic wear. All companies are pushing this work down on the supplier. So if you're doing business with any company like these, or even a much smaller scale, you're probably going to or are getting these types of questionnaires. And somebody in your organization may be filling them out, and who knows how they're doing it. All right. Just to kind of give you the types of areas that they go through, they, as CDP, meaning they have really 3 categories that you would sign up for as a customer of theirs that they would push down. And depending on the region and what they're interested in, they would choose. Again, climate change is what today's focus is. They want to know about climate risk. and emissions. But if you're in a forestry area and you're developing forest, they want to know forest, your effects are on forests, or water scarcity if you're in LA and that you have no water. So these are the types of questions. These are the areas they cover. Again, it's a subscriber by subscriber basis on what they pick, but this is what CDP does. And then the last part I want to go into for CDP, if you switch, is the data request on emissions. So there's no way I don't think anyone can actually read these, but if they had really good eyes, you can see it's broken up into 3 parts. They want to know your policies and procedures on climate change. So climate identifying, evaluating climate risk, what's your policy governance, those types of questions. They want to know your greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, or scope 1 and 2 in this. I'm going to go into what that means, scope 1 and 2. I keep using these acronyms, but I think of the utilities that you pay. So bills that you pay for utilities or energy usage is probably all scope 1 and 2. Just know that. And then they want to know scope 3 emissions, which are emissions associated with things that you don't pay for. So downstream and upstream activities, it would be your greenhouse gas emissions. And then they want to know about your emission targets. And you complete this survey and it goes into a database. And then again, companies like you're benchmarked against, and some people do better, underperform, others overperform, and you're compared to them and people evaluate it. And CDP once a year comes out with a list of A-rated top 50 companies that have the best emissions profile, and all of that information comes from this data request. The one thing they do require, I just skipped over, is verification statement. Today, a lot of people don't have this information verified. It's self-reported, which means take my word for it. And it's from a CPA firm. We always have trouble with that part of it. But more and more, it's migrating into having firms like CPA firms issue assurance reports so that gives it more credibility. And then for CDP, when you have more credibility, they're able to advance you to that A status. So if you want to be an A, you got to have that verification report. Next page. All right, so that is how you report to your supplier. So if you have questions, now would be a good time to ask on that portion of it, because the next part is, how do private companies report to their owners? Well, the only real owners that care are the private equity owners. Oh, Jim.
Yeah, 2 things. An administration question came in. Unfortunately, this is not CPE eligible for the hour today. There's different requirements that we need to comply with polling questions, and we just thought it was a little awkward and not productive. But we do have, from time to time, CPE seminars that will alert this crew too. And then the next question, Joe, how do most companies find the resources to answer these data requests? Seems rather daunting to get this in the mail or email and then, what do we got to do?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's no CPE. I don't know. No.
Sorry.
I need CPE. Anyway, yeah, I asked that same question, by the way. So how do firms do it? Well, I mean, there's a number of different ways, but self-serving in a way to say we do outsource ESG administration, where we help companies supplement their business to complete these documents, so that when a CDP request comes in, we would help produce that document. But you also, though, I go back to, it's about processes and controls, where if you do have the right processes and controls in place, you're able to just leverage your systems. So your accounting systems can spit out a lot of this information on the side, and then using a consultant like ourselves to do the calculations and do the reporting, which is very little of time then. Efficient uses of our resources is how a lot of companies handle this. Otherwise, if you are larger, you can always handle it within your accounts payable group or within your procurement group who have access to the information. But again, it's about building the process, gathering the information within your system so that you can automatically report it and you're not looking through your vendor files. That's kind of the way we see people doing it.
Thank you.
On to the owners now. This is a little bit more tricky. Oh, you're way ahead. Go back. Go back one more. Okay. CPE really threw us for a loop, didn't it? ESG data conversions project. So I was going through who really owns and cares about your ESG profiles. It's typically when you're owned by outside money, and outside money is typically private equity when you're in the world of the private companies. You don't have shareholders, public shareholders, because you're not public. So this is private company, and depending on the size of the private equity firm is their interest in ESG. So to let you know, the beginning of this year, a group of investors got together, which are these private equity firms, representing $10 trillion of assets, investable assets, which is quite large. And if you think about it, those are $10 trillion of assets invested in private companies across the globe. And what they're asking for these private companies to do is report to them certain ESG information on a portfolio company level, being companies like yourselves, to then be able to benchmark the results of those so that companies, all of these investors can benchmark all these underlying portfolio companies against similar portfolio companies and similar results. So that is the essence of what they're trying to do. And I just want to get into what the data is that they're collecting. And then I want to move on to waste. So if you go to the next slide, please. So the data they're collecting, I find it to be pretty interesting, is they're looking for one, not interesting, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. That makes a lot of sense. They're looking for renewable energy, what percentage is there? Again, it's energy related. We talked about climate. A lot of the world is very interested in climate, as they should be. Diversity is a US concept, and they're looking for diversity of the board members, of senior management. They want to know percentage of women versus men. But notice that the US is really only ones that represent, look to LGBTQ plus or underrepresented groups. But the rest of the world is more concerned about men and women in terms of diversity. The one that I think is interesting that they're looking at, and this really hits home for manufacturing, it shows that a lot of this does address the world of manufacturing, is workplace injuries. These are all the KPIs. If I were to look to measure your ESG profile for due diligence, I would want to know about injuries, fatalities, days lost to injuries. They don't go into looking if you have like a near miss policies or other workplace safety policies, but these are really good KPIs. If you have big numbers there, there's probably a problem. And then new hires is just, I think, more for them to show that their investment generated this many new jobs. I don't know how much attrition in employee surveys actually will tell them, but they do look at that. I do know that my clients like to calculate new hires to see how many new jobs that they've created, and then tell the world 1 year later that we brought on 5,000 new created 5,000 new jobs in a particular region. So that's what I have on reporting to customers, which was CDP, the primary way of doing it. And now they have this way of a standardized way of reporting to owners that you're going to start seeing more and more of, which is the data convergence projects. So with that, I want to move now, shift gears a bit and go into, well, the financial impact of ESG on a company. And we're going to start with waste. So Sophia, take it away.
Yes, and as Joe knows, waste is one of my favorite things to talk about because reducing waste is one of the easiest ways to reduce emissions because everybody wins. It's not about reducing production or really impacting a way a company functions in output. It's looking towards the waste that is already happening. And shifting towards a zero waste supply chain simply means going from a linear production process where you just kind of output, you don't really think about where your product is going, to a circular economy where you're actually considering, okay, I'm producing something, this is the amount of waste that happens in production, but what happens after it reaches my consumer's hands? And this kind of focus on a circular economy has definitely been more predominant in the West, at least considering it after in 2017, China and other Asian countries began saying, you know what, we are not going to continue to allow you to export your waste to our countries. So we are grappling with this really big waste problem, not only the emission aspect, but also where is it all going? It's ending up in landfills, in the ocean, in open site landfills. It's a big problem. And again, it's one of the most exciting problems because it doesn't benefit anyone. So reducing it is in everyone's best interest. And that can bring us to the next slide, which is understanding extended producer responsibility, EPR, which is a kind of new concept in the United States. Europe, again, as Joe mentioned, is always kind of ahead of the curve, and they are really taking on this idea of EPR, which in short just means that instead of what we currently do, which is say, okay, you bought this product, you're totally responsible for figuring out what happens to it after you're done with it, producers are now being asked to join in that thinking process. So it's not, of course, some companies are doing this just voluntarily, but that's also because they have the foresight to see that regulations are coming in. For example, already a dozen states in the US are already considering implementing EPR policies. So it's moving into this regulatory aspect, which means that the people that start considering it first and investing in creating an EPR plan are going to be ahead of the curve and can save money in the long term. So that means just investing in a zero waste supply chain now, instead of waiting until you're getting slapped on the wrist for not having it, which can come with fees and potentially loss in consumers, because we're also seeing that people are beginning to be more concerned about how a company is involved in this relationship with the product. And that brings us to our next slide, which is about waste reduction strategies. So the good news is that manufacturers don't have to worry too much about, oh, how am I going to do this? Because much of the process of manufacturing is automated, which means that the easiest way to reduce waste is easy, which is designing new products that are easier to reduce, repair and recycle, or reuse, repair and recycle. And we're already seeing things like this come into play. For example, in New York, a right to repair law is being enacted. So we're seeing a very big shift in how manufacturers are being asked to collaborate in this process. But of course, there's also ways such as pickup and recycling programs within companies. For example, some apparel companies are saying, okay, once you're done, feel free to bring this back and we'll resell it for a reduced price. That is something that's new and amazing. And again, it's saving everyone money, and focusing on it sooner than later is also going to save money by avoiding these regulatory fees. And I'm happy to answer any questions about this, but I'll pass it back to Joe.
Well, thank you, Sophia. Yeah, people overlook waste and forget that waste costs money. Both you bought it and then you're throwing it away. So it actually costs money twice. So yeah, very good. Moving on to another thing that costs money that people aren't aware of is climate change. Whether you believe it or not, there is a financial impact to climate change on financial statements. And that is what the initiative behind the SEC's climate change proposal is that they want companies, public companies now we're shifting away from private to public, but what happens in reporting for public companies oftentimes does get pushed down to private companies, as you all have seen. And the requirements are that the SEC says that all public companies in the next year or two need to implement a TCFD framework on climate change reporting. So on climate related issues, they follow a TCFD framework, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. They're also asking companies to disclose the financial consequences of climate related risks greater than 1% on related financial statement lines. So you're actually going to the financial statement and say, this is the effect of climate change on those lines. And I'll talk about later on how that's done. Again, they want to know scope 1 and 2 emissions. Remember, the bills, energy bills that we pay are scope 1 and 2 emissions. They want to know absolute and intensity. Intensity just means they want to have it normalized based on revenue. So they can compare two different companies' GHG emissions intensities based upon revenue. So and then if it's material, they'll want scope 3 emissions, but we know, and we'll talk about in a little bit why that's a real problematic for companies. And then the last part that us CPAs love is that they're going to require scope 1 and 2 emissions to be audited. But that does make a lot of sense, because if you think about it, those information is going to be in a financial statements, and the financial statements themselves are going to be audited.
Hey, Joe, we got a handicap question from the audience, possibly somebody that's charged with preparing these disclosures. Do you think the SEC climate disclosure will ever go into effect?
Well,
good luck.
So I'm not sure. So a big push behind the climate change disclosure has been the investors. So the investors of the world pushed for information and reporting by companies, registrant companies, on the risk, the financial effects of the risks of climate change. Now, does climate change affect all companies equally? Is it material to all companies? And what's going to happen is different states, we'll mention Texas, for instance, will fight back and say the SEC overreached their authority and try to hold up the law, should it be proposed, or the regulation, in the courts for a period of time. Eventually it will go through. I do think it will be held up for a period of time. Depending on who the administration is, it'll affect that. But ultimately it will get pushed through, whether implemented voluntarily or through regulation. Companies will be reporting this information because it was a directive of the shareholders who want this information, and shareholders can control what the company does and reports, whether it's a requirement or not of the SEC, and having the SEC simply put out the rules to follow, whether they're fully enacted or not. I think so. The answer is probably not right away, but it will happen.
Okay. Thank you.
So we talked about it audited. So let me go on to the TCFD, because this is an important part. The next slide. So the TCFD stands for the Task Force of Climate Related Financial Disclosures. I do have to read that because I'll never remember what that means. This was an initiative created by Michael Bloomberg. He founded it, financed the entire initiative. And the purpose behind it was to create a framework for companies to report climate risk to their investors. That was it. And the framework they created, you see in the box where you have governance, strategy, risk management, metrics. Now, what makes it interesting is that the governance, the SEC is following this framework pretty much to the letter. And what the SEC wants is they want a governance, and they think about what governance means, which is they're looking for strong internal controls over the collection of ESG information, both risks and metrics reporting. So what I talked about earlier, does it take a long time? If you do have strong internal controls, those internal controls will collect information quicker, better for you. But it's something that you have to implement, and it's something that CPA firms are very good at implementing in companies. You also should have an ESG committee or something like that, a board position that oversees the overall ESG program. they have a strategy. What are you going to do? How are you going to address things? Risk management is more obvious, where you identify climate change risks. And I listed some of those 3 risks below, which we're going to go through one at a time in a moment. And then metrics, which are obviously your GHG emissions. I do think the slide, the comic at the bottom is pretty funny and says, what happens if, what is it? What happens if it's all a big hoax and we just create a great new world for ourselves? I mean, that's, in the end, that's what we're doing, is creating a better world for ourselves. And we're also probably saving a company a lot of money. As CDP mentioned, they're saving $29 billion simply by measuring and managing your emissions. So next slide, please. So just going through the risks, people don't necessarily understand there is a lot of risks associated with climate change. You have acute risks and chronic risks related to a physical asset. So physical assets are typically a plant and equipment where business activity needs to take place in a specific location. So if you're subject to extreme weather conditions such as floods, hurricanes, fire, smokes, cyclones, I guess that would be the other, Japan and the other side of the planet, or chronic, which is high temperatures or droughts and items like that. Those are sea level rises if you're close to the beach, erosion, are all factors to consider when measuring your physical risks. And what the SEC is looking for is you to quantify the dollars that those risks could represent should they occur. So say if you have one plant and it's located in Louisiana and it gets knocked out every year from a hurricane, which they seem to hit the same spot every year, it takes you 1 month to get the plant back and up to operations. You'll lose 1 month of revenue. What is that line item? And you would report the loss of 1 month of revenue, and that's quantifying the effect of physical risk from a climate change. And you would go about the same way, and this is, again, your internal controls and your governance would determine how to calculate this. But if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. You have a flood, you lose access to, your workers lose access to the facilities. Or if you have fire and smoke and you're in California and you have to shut down your facilities because of that, and other different items. A lot of times in Florida, you use insurance to mitigate the damage and the risk from that, so that you mitigate the actual expense to it. But if it does raise to the level of 1% of a financial statement line under the current proposal, then you would need to report it. But remember that it's only a proposal, and the SEC may come back and use a 5% threshold, which personally I feel is more reasonable. The next risk is transitional risk. Next page. And transitional risks are a little less apparent, a little less applicable, but something that you thought about is there's a transition technology where we're talking about a high carbon to low carbon economies. If you're able to take advantage of this transition to the low carbon economy, whether it's something that you're manufacturing in a way that will create a lower footprint for the ultimate buyer of it, if it's a product that's more adaptable to the new environment. So that would be, say, market change, where people are preferring a certain types of products. And then there's a reputational transition where companies are thinking about, what is their carbon footprint, what is their environmental impact, and there isn't always a reputation, and it's becoming more and more prevalent. So that's sort of a transitional risk. And then there you have regulatory risk, which is the next slide. Maybe. And that, again, this is government policy. A lot of this more pertains to the real estate industry, where governments are starting to tax buildings that have carbon footprints beyond a certain intensity level per square foot. New York City has a law going in effect, a local law 97 next year, where they're going to tax, or 2024, where they're going to tax companies or businesses that have a carbon footprint above a certain number per square foot. On the legal side, this is more automobile industry, but there are out there where pollution and policies are coming out to reduce emissions, tailpipe emissions, EPA miles per gallon, or the auto side. I'm sure there's others that I'm not thinking about it now. But anyway, those are regulatory risks. Go on. And now I want to get into the scopes. So I said I was going to get into the scopes, and I just want to kind of go through what each of the scopes are. And I saved it to the end because they're kind of technical, and not many people always want to hear about how we calculate or what each scope means. As I said, scope 1 and 2 are what bills you pay. Scope 3 is other people's emissions. But you could see a nice graph here for those who look at the presentation. When we hand it out, you can pretty much highlights all the main factors in terms of where scope 1, 2, and 3 lay out. If you turn the page, I want to just talk about each of the scopes and emission reduction strategies. And some of them actually pertain to reducing the amount of energy used. So you have your scope 1, which is the 4 types of emissions. Greenhouse gas protocol is the one that named these and created these categories. But you can see natural gas for heating, LPG is heating, fuel oil heating. Typically that's those sources of emissions. You burn it on your facility, that's earned it the right to be called scope 1. You have gasoline and diesel. Those are typically for your forklifts and your vehicles. If you have company cars, I don't see many company cars anymore, but if they're there, that gas goes in there. If you own a private jet, that's where, I guess jet fuel would also be mobile combustion. A big source of emissions is refrigeration. So if you have cold storage, you would again have a lot of emissions there. And then processing, if your processes create emissions, cement, steel manufacturing, things like that. I want to leave some time for the questions at the end, so I'm not going to go too much into this, but you can see by upgrading to electrifying your facility, you will reduce your emissions. By fixing leaks in your refrigerations, you will have a significant impact on your climate change profile, because those fugitive emissions are 2, 3 to 1,000 times more potent than carbon emissions. And then instituting emission vectors. Go to scope 2, and I'm going to just scope 2 is electricity. Again, it's sort of the same thing. Weathering, reducing your energy usage, the same thing you would do at home. But those are scope 2 emissions. The reason why they're scope 2 is that they were created outside your facility and they're used inside your facility. So that's grid electric, purchase steam, and that's a New York City unique thing. Next slide. Scope 3 is really a crazy area, and probably I could spend 15, 20 minutes on scope 3, but just think about it. You're trying to estimate your emissions for the goods that you're purchasing from your supplier, because unless you're creating it from scratch, you're probably not mining the metals that you're using to shape. You're not, there's somebody in line, and those purchased goods have an emissions factor. There's a way to calculate that using the amount of money spent and EPA tables. And you can read the rest of these, but you can see some of them: end of life usage, predicting do they throw it away, do they recycle it, or use of product. Think of for apparel, if I wash my jeans in hot water or cold water, it'll affect the greenhouse gas emissions for scope 3. And then how do you measure the boundaries, say for purchased goods, especially agricultural? How far back do you go into the farm? Do you go to the fertilizer that was used to grow the grass for the cow to eat? To use, if the land was rented, how does it all factor in? And every company has a different take on this. No two companies are the same in our analysis, regardless of how detailed they go. So that's kind of quickly going through it, what we have for our presentation today. But
Joe and Sophia, a couple questions have surfaced with respect to big oil companies. What challenges do they face with the emerging focus on emissions and going green And I guess the follow-up is there any relief on these given the turmoil in the energy market these days?
So Sophia, we just went through, can an oil company be green?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm coming out of the Sustainable Development Program at Columbia and hearing a lot of young people talk about this. And there's actually this big incentive to go into oil companies because we do need natural oil as we transition to a greener economy. And why, of course, there's no way for them to be completely green, but there's ways to improve. Joe and I did a really interesting project looking into oil rig compression units. And we found that like those can be electric, and that actually does a lot to reduce emissions. So there's a way to improve every industry. We obviously want to see a shift towards a zero emission, zero waste economy, but in that transition, we need to support those things that are going to get us there. And oil is one of them.
A longer scenario or a longer runway to get that, but yeah, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, and you can see right now, because there was such a backlash in Europe, today I was reading they're actually refiring up their coal burning plants for electric generation. So because they were trying to accelerate the transition from oil from fossil fuels to renewables without actually having the infrastructure for renewables in place first, they're actually causing themselves now to have to go backwards. So yes, there is a place for it. People need to consider it. You can't just turn your head to it and they're a huge contributor towards greenhouse gas emissions, but if done right, they don't have to be as big. And then over time, yes, we will phase it out, but today, make them a little greener.
Yeah, and England certainly has a number of wind farms, onshore and offshore. So it's interesting that they've gone back to coal as a fallback. Okay. All right. We are in the middle of proxy season with public companies. Have shareholders embraced sustainability initiatives in their voting?
Well, as someone who writes ESG policies for companies, for owners of these companies, yes, they do embrace it. But I do hear from the directors of companies that a huge percentage of proxy voting policies are related to ESG. And when I mentioned before about whether the SEC rules or the climate change rules will be adopted, right now, ESG proxies are asking their companies to report on certain climate change issues. They're asking them to go net zero, which is something, those are climate change reduction targets. And they're the ones behind pushing companies like General Motors, like Exxon committing to reducing their emissions by 50% to do these. They weren't doing it on their own, and it's really proxies are the voice of the people. So yes, they're hearing ESG every day.
Market driven to a certain degree, right?
Market driven, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I'm contemplating a sale of my business and I source a lot of my components from foreign suppliers. What do I need to do in advance of a transaction? And presumably, I'm reading into this via ESG documentation and such.
Well, supplier code of conduct, we talked about in the beginning, the importance of it, but then you got to look at the teeth. So when you're doing a foreign, especially Southeast Asia, and you're looking at the supply chain within there, you have to think of who you're dealing with. There's so many vendors out there. You got to look at the verification that's actually followed, whether it was just a verbal verification or whether it was an on-the-ground physical audit by somebody verifying that the people are doing what they're doing, as well as reputation. So there's a lot of risk to be, especially in the apparel business, considering most cotton garments come out of China, and 85% of China's cotton is produced in the Zhanghong, the Muslim community that's being exploited, where we're not allowed to buy from. And somehow they get that into the system. So I would say, do your due diligence, ESG due diligence heavily on the supply chain, looking for actual boots on the ground verification.
Great. Thank you, Joe. I don't see any other questions coming in from our panel, and we're just about out of time. So thank you for attending today. Thank you, Sophia and Joe and Alexis, for your work on the presentation. And I guess in closing, wherever you are on the ESG journey, you know, we here at Witham are happy to consult with you, give you a sense of, you know, what's going on in the marketplace and what the best practices are and what the emerging rules changes are, as you saw from the SEC disclosure on climate that Joe spoke to. So I'd encourage everybody, we're going to share a copy of the presentation with you afterwards. Take a look at it, share it with your colleagues. Obviously, it's going to be a long journey for people, but it's here to stay. And I think we have to reconcile ourselves to that. So Joe, Sophia, any other final comments before we call it a day?
We're here for you if you have issues or troubles. So.
Yes, don't hesitate to reach out with questions. We're more than happy to answer anything.
Yeah, and challenges become opportunities. So let's look at it in that vein. So thanks, everybody. All the best. Stay safe. Enjoy the upcoming 4th of July holidays. Travel safe. And I guess if we're traveling, check the flight status before you hit the airport. Unfortunately, I guess a lot of the airlines, Joe, are making their emissions number by not flying. So maybe that's it. Who knows? So
That's a good way to look at it.
all right. Well, thank you, everybody, and appreciate your support in attending today's seminar. Take care. Stay well.
Bye.